In the mountains of Colorado, winter is unforgiving. He arrives without warning, covering everything with a white cloak that hides both beauty and danger. Snow falls for days, sometimes weeks, turning trails into traps and huts into isolated islands in a sea of ice. It's a place where loneliness can be both a choice and a sentence, where silence weighs like lead and the nights seem to last forever, where a man quickly learns that nature doesn't care about his plans or his dreams. This is the story of a man who learned that lesson, and a winter night that changed everything. The year was 1869, and Henry Dawson was 43 years old. He had been a miner for almost a decade, since gold fever had swept the country and drawn thousands of men to the mountains in search of their fortune. Most of these men had given up long ago. They had returned to their cities, to their families, to lives that didn't involve digging through frozen earth for shiny rocks. They had realized that dreams of wealth were, for the vast majority, just that, dreams. But Henry had stayed, not because he was stubborn, although he was, not because I didn't have anywhere to go back to, although I didn't. He had stayed because, at some point over the years, the mountains had become his home. Silence had become his company. Loneliness had become his friend. Henry lived in a small cabin he had built himself, nestled in a valley between two peaks he had never bothered to name. The cabin wasn't much. 4 wooden walls, a roof that leaked when the snow melted too quickly, a fireplace that was its only source of heat. But it was his, and after a lifetime of not really owning anything, that meant something. His mine was just a few minutes' walk from the cabin, an opening in the mountainside that he had carved out over the years. It wasn't a rich girl. He had never found the great vein he dreamed of, the discovery that would transform his life. But he found enough, small nuggets, slowly accumulating gold dust, to buy provisions when he went down to the city twice a year. It was a simple life, lonely, but Henry had made peace with that. That winter of 1869, the snow came earlier and heavier than usual. Henry had prepared himself, as he always did. I had stockpiled enough firewood for months. He had provisions, beans, flour, dried meat, coffee, stored in animal-proof barrels. He had repaired the holes in the roof and reinforced the door against the winds that howled on the coldest nights. But nothing could have prepared him for what that winter would bring. The storm arrived in early December. Henry woke up on what was supposed to be a bright morning and discovered that the world had disappeared. Where there had once been mountains and trees and sky, now there was only white. A wall of falling snow so thick he could barely see the pile of firewood just a few feet from the door. He stayed inside the cabin and waited. The storm lasted 3 days. When he finally stopped, the snow reached almost to the cabin window. Henry had to dig for hours just to open the door, and when he finally managed to get out, he discovered that the world he knew had been completely transformed. The trails were gone. The landmarks he used to orient himself were buried. Even the tallest trees seemed to have shrunk, their branches sagging under the weight of the accumulated snow. Henry knew he was trapped, at least until some of the snow melted or hardened enough to walk on. Weeks, probably, maybe a month. He wasn't worried. It had provisions. There was firewood. He had patience, forged by years of solitude. He would survive, as he always did. The second storm arrived a week after the first. This was even worse. Snow fell for 5 days straight, accompanied by winds that made the cabin shake and howl like a dying animal. The temperature plummeted to levels Henry had never experienced. The cold was so intense that the water in the bucket near the fireplace froze during the night, even with the fire lit. Henry started to worry, not with the snow, which would eventually melt, not with the cold, which would eventually pass, but with the firewood, which was decreasing faster than he had calculated, with the provisions, which would have to last longer than he had planned. For the first time in many years, Henry Dawson felt afraid. It was on the 10th night after the second storm that everything changed. Henry was sitting by the fireplace, feeding the fire with smaller and smaller pieces of wood, trying to make what was left last. The wind had finally stopped, and a deep silence enveloped the cabin. The kind of silence that seems to have weight, that presses on your ears and makes your heart beat louder. It was in this silence that Henry heard something, a faint sound, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere out there. He stood still, listening. For a moment he thought he had imagined it. That loneliness was finally affecting his mind, making him hear things that weren't there. But then, the sound came again, a groan, low and faint, but definitely real. Henry got up and walked to the door. He hesitated for a moment, his hand on the latch. Opening the door meant letting in the cold, wasting the precious heat he had fought so hard to maintain. It meant risking your own survival for what could just be a wounded animal. But Henry Dawson wasn't the kind of man to ignore a groan of pain. He opened the door. The cold hit him like a punch, knocking the air from his lungs. The moon was high and full, illuminating the snowy landscape with a silvery light that turned everything into a world of dreams and shadows. And there, Just a few meters from the door, a dark shape stood out against the white snow. It was a man. Henry ran, or tried to run, sinking into the snow up to his knees with each step. When he reached the fallen form, his heart sank. The man was unconscious, his breathing so faint it was almost imperceptible. His skin was tanned, his long black hair was covered in ice crystals. He wore leather and fur clothes that Henry recognized immediately. It was an Apache. Henry didn't hesitate. He lifted the man in his arms. He was lighter than he should have been, his thinness speaking of days without food, and carried him into the hut. He placed him on the only mattress he had, near the fireplace, and began to work. First, he removed the wet, frozen clothes and replaced them with dry blankets. Then he fed the fire, using more wood than he should have, but knowing he had no choice. He prepared a hot broth with the few ingredients he had and began to offer it to the unconscious man, drop by drop. Henry worked all night. The Apache woke up just before dawn. His eyes shot open, black and deep, filled with confusion and alarm. He tried to get up, but his body wouldn't obey. It was too weak. Henry slowly raised his hands, showing that they were empty. He said, in the calmest voice he could muster, that the man was safe, that had been found in the snow, that he was in a cabin near the fire, and that no one was going to hurt him. The Apache watched him for a long moment. His eyes took in Henry, the cabin, the situation. He was clearly trying to decide if he could trust this stranger who had brought him inside. Eventually, something in his expression relaxed. Not completely, the caution was still there, but enough. He said a single word. His voice was hoarse, weak, but clear. Thanks. The following days established a strange routine. The Apache, who Henry discovered was called Kuruk, which meant bear in his language, was seriously weakened. Not injured, at least not visibly, but exhausted to the bone. His body had burned through everything it had trying to survive the cold, and now it needed time to recover. Henry took care of him as he would a brother. He shared his provisions, which were already meager, ensuring that Kuruk ate even when it meant he himself would go hungry. He kept the fire going day and night using wood that he had planned to save for later. He gave Kuruk the best blankets, the warmest place by the fireplace. Kuruk watched all this silently. His eyes followed Henry around the cabin, studying every move, every choice. He didn't speak much, partly because he was still weak, partly because his English was limited. But there was an intensity in his gaze that said he was paying attention. Who was recording every act of kindness? By the third day, Kuruk was strong enough to sit up. In the fifth, to stand and take a few steps. On the seventh, he insisted on helping with the cabin chores, even when Henry said it wasn't necessary. It was while they were working together, chopping what little firewood was left, that Kuruk told his story. He was from a village several days' travel away, in the mountains to the south. He had gone on a hunting expedition with 3 other warriors when the first storm caught them by surprise. They had become separated in the confusion, each trying to find shelter wherever they could. Kuruk had wandered for days, lost in a white world without landmarks or direction. He had eaten what he could find, almost nothing, and slept in caves and under trees when he was too tired. When the second storm hit, he knew he wouldn't survive. He had walked until he could walk no more. I had fallen into the snow and waited for the end. And then he had woken up in a warm cabin with a stranger watching over him. Henry listened to the story in silence. When Kuruk finished, he didn't say anything for a moment. Then he asked if Kuruk thought the 3 other warriors had survived. Kuruk said he didn't know. He said he hoped so. He said they were strong, experienced men and that they knew the mountains well. But he also said that that winter was different, harder, more ruthless. Henry nodded. He understood. The weeks passed. The winter continued relentlessly, but there were no more storms, like the first 2. The snow remained deep, but it gradually compacted, becoming firm enough to walk on without sinking into the waste. Henry and Kuruk developed a routine. They shared the tasks of survival, chopping firewood, melting snow for water, preparing the simple meals that dwindling provisions allowed. They worked side by side, in a comfortable silence punctuated by brief conversations. Kuruk taught Henry Apache words. Henry taught Kuruk English words. Neither was a particularly good teacher, but that didn't matter. The effort itself was what counted. Little by little, something began to grow between them. It wasn't just gratitude, although there was a lot of that. It wasn't just necessity, although 2 men trapped together in a cabin certainly depended on each other. It was something deeper, rarer, respect, understanding, the beginning of a true friendship. Kuruk told stories about his people, about your traditions, your beliefs, your way of seeing the world. He told about his family, a wife named Nijoni, which meant beautiful, and a younger brother who was the best tracker in the village. He told about the hunts he participated in, about the ceremonies that celebrated the seasons, about the elders who guarded the wisdom of generations. Henry listened, fascinated. He had never thought much about native people before. They were just part of the landscape, distant figures he saw occasionally but never really knew. Now, listening to Kuruk speak, I realized how much richness there was in his culture. how much wisdom, how much beauty. In return, Henry told his own story. He told about his difficult childhood on a farm that barely produced enough to feed the family, about the premature death of his parents, which left him alone in the world at the age of 16, about the jobs he had done, farmer, loader, builder, before he heard about the gold in the mountains and decided to try his luck. He talked about the years of loneliness, about the hopes that he had brought with him and that had been slowly eroded by time, about the way he had closed himself off from the world, building invisible walls that kept others at bay. Kuruk listened carefully, and when Henry finished, he said something that stuck in his memory. He said loneliness was like snow. She could seem protective, a shield against the world, but if she stayed for too long, her heart would freeze. He said no man was made to live alone, that even the strongest warriors of his people needed their tribe, their family, their connections. He said Henry had a good heart. That was clear from the way he had acted, welcoming a stranger when he could have closed the door. He said a heart like that shouldn't stay frozen forever. Henry didn't respond, but he thought about those words for a long time. Winter eventually began to break. The days got a little longer. The sun shone a little warmer. The snow began to melt, first in drops, then in small streams that ran down the mountainsides. Kuruk was completely recovered now. Strong, healthy, eager to return to his village and find out if the other warriors had survived, if your family was okay. Henry knew the moment to say goodbye was coming, and to his own surprise, he found that the idea saddened him. Somewhere during those winter weeks, he had gotten used to having company. He had gotten used to the conversations, the shared work, the presence of another human being in his silent cabin. The idea of returning to the solitude of before felt, for the first time, not like peace, but like emptiness. The morning Kuruk left, the sky was clear and the air had a hint of spring. The two men stood in front of the cabin, the rising sun painting the mountains gold. Kuruk said he would never forget what Henry had done. He said that in his culture, saving a life created a bond that lasted forever. He said that Henry was now part of his story, his family, his people. Henry tried to say he hadn't done anything special. Who had just acted like any decent person would. Kuruk smiled and said that was exactly what made the gesture special. He said that true kindness did not ask for recognition. He said that a heart that acted without expecting reward was the most valuable kind of heart there was. So he made a promise. He said he would come back. That when spring truly arrived, when the trails were open and travel was safe, he would return to show Henry that his kindness would not be forgotten. Henry nodded, not knowing what to say. The two men hugged each other, a strange gesture for both of them, but one that felt right at the time. And then Kuruk left, his figure slowly shrinking until he disappeared between the trees. Henry returned to the empty cabin. The silence felt heavier than before. The next few weeks were strange for Henry. He went back to his routine, working in the mine, tending the cabin, surviving one day at a time. But something had changed. Something inside him was no longer the same. He found himself looking at the path Kuruk had left, expecting to see a figure approaching. He found himself thinking about the stories Kuruk had told, the words of wisdom he had shared. For the first time in years, he found himself feeling truly alone. The snow continued to melt. Streams grew into streams, streams into small rivers. The first flowers appeared on the lower slopes, patches of color against the brown of the newly exposed earth. Spring was coming, and with it, a change that Henry could never have predicted. It happened one April morning, when the world was finally waking up from its long winter sleep. Henry was outside the cabin, repairing a part of the roof that had caved in under the weight of the snow, when he saw movement on the trail. His heart jumped. He got down from the roof and stood there, watching. The approaching figure was Kuruk. This he recognized immediately. But Kuruk was not alone. Behind him, emerging from the trees in a seemingly endless procession, came others. 10, 20, 30, more and more until Henry lost count. They were men and women, young and old, some mounted on horses, others on foot, all carrying something, packages, baskets, tools, provisions. Henry stood frozen, not understanding what was happening. Kuruk dismounted his horse and walked towards him. Her face was lit up with a smile that Henry had never seen before. He said he had promised to come back. He said he had promised to show that Henry's kindness would not be forgotten. And then he explained. When Kuruk had arrived at his village, he discovered that the other 3 warriors had survived. His family was fine. Everyone was relieved and happy to see him alive. But when Kuruk told his story about the lonely white man who had found him in the snow, who had shared his fire and his food, who had cared for him without asking for anything in return, something happened. The village elders were deeply touched. They said a man like that was rare. They said such kindness deserved to be honored in the highest way they knew. And then they made a decision. They would come to Henry, not just a few, but many. They would bring gifts, yes, but they would bring something more important. They would bring their skills, their knowledge, their work. They would bring the best their community had to offer. Henry looked at the crowd that continued to arrive, unable to process what he was seeing. Kuruk explained what would happen. The men would help Henry expand his cabin, building additional rooms with techniques that would last for generations. The women would bring seeds and teach how to cultivate plants that grew well in that climate. The elders would share knowledge about the land, where to find water in the dry months, which plants were medicinal, how to read the signs of nature. And there was more. A man approached with 2 horses, strong, healthy animals that were worth more than anything Henry owned. Another brought metal tools, finer and sturdier than anything Henry could buy in town. A woman brought blankets woven in elaborate patterns, warm enough to weather any winter. Gift after gift was placed in front of Henry until he could no longer see the ground they were on. He tried to protest, said it was too much. He said he didn't deserve all that. He said he had just done what anyone would do. Kuruk shook his head. He said that was exactly what Henry didn't understand. He said most people wouldn't do what he had done. He said most would close the door, protect what was theirs, let the stranger die in the snow. He said Henry had chosen differently, and that choice had consequences. He said that in his culture, a life saved was a debt that could never be fully repaid. But they could try. That they wanted to try. He said that from that day on, Henry was no longer a stranger. He was a friend. It was family. He was part of something bigger than himself. The following weeks transformed Henry's life in ways he never could have imagined. The little cabin became a real house with separate bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and a porch where he could sit and observe the mountains. The Apaches worked with impressive efficiency, each one knowing exactly what to do, as if they were dancing a dance practiced for generations. The surrounding land was prepared for cultivation. Henry learned to plant corn, beans, pumpkins. The 3 sisters, as the natives called them, who grew together in harmony and helped each other. He learned about herbs that cured pain and fever, about roots that could be eaten when other foods were lacking. But more than the physical changes, it was the internal changes that marked Henry. For the first time in decades, he wasn't alone. People came to visit him regularly. Kuruk would appear every few weeks, bringing news from the village and sometimes staying for a few days. Other members of the tribe would pass by when they were hunting in the area, stopping for a meal and conversation. Henry learned their names, their stories, their personalities. He discovered that he enjoyed having company, that conversations, even simple ones, filled a void he didn't even know existed, that silence was much more bearable when it was a choice, not a sentence. And he discovered something else. He discovered that he had a lot to offer, too. His experience as a miner was valuable. He knew techniques that the Apache did not. He knew where to find certain minerals that they used in their paints and ceremonies. His knowledge of the white man's world was useful. He could negotiate on their behalf in the city, translate when necessary, warn of dangers they might not notice. He was not just a recipient of kindness. He was a participant in an exchange, a member of a community, a person with value and purpose. It was a feeling he had forgotten existed. The following years were the best of Henry Dawson's life. His small property prospered. The garden produced more than he could eat, allowing him to share it with visitors and even sell the surplus in the city. The horses he had received multiplied, creating a small herd that was his security for the future. And the mine, which he had almost abandoned, finally revealed its secret. It was Kuruk who noticed it first. During one visit, he noticed the rocks that Henry had piled up outside the mine and asked about a specific type of stone. He said his people knew that stone, that it was a sign of something valuable nearby. Henry returned to the mine with new eyes, and 3 days later he found what he had been looking for a decade. A vein of gold, not huge, but substantial. Enough to change his life in practical ways, to ensure he would never go hungry or cold again. But the irony was not lost on Henry. He had spent years looking for that gold, and only found it when he stopped looking. When his life had been filled with other riches, friendship, purpose, belonging, the gold finally appeared. As if the universe was teaching him a lesson he needed to learn. Henry Dawson lived to be 79. He never married, never had children of his own. But he didn't live alone. His home in the mountains became a meeting point, a place where different cultures crossed paths and understood each other. Merchants stopped to rest. Travelers sought shelter. Members of Kuruk's tribe came and went like family. And when Henry finally left, on a quiet spring night much like the one on which his life had changed, he was not alone. Kuruk was at his side, holding his hand. The same man he had found in the snow so many years before, now also gray-haired, also scarred by time. The 2 friends didn't need words in that final moment. Everything that needed to be said had already been said, over decades of friendship. Henry closed his eyes with a smile on his face, and Kuruk remained by his side until the end. Henry Dawson's funeral was unlike any the region had ever seen. White men from the city came to pay their respects to the miner who everyone respected. But dozens of Apaches also came, including the village chief and all the elders, 2 cultures side by side, honoring a man who had built a bridge between them. Kuruk spoke at the ceremony. He told the story of that winter night so many years ago. He told about the door that opened when it could have remained closed, about the fire that was shared when it could have been saved, about the kindness that was offered when it could have been withheld. He said Henry had saved his life that night. But he also said that Henry had done something even greater. He had proven that kindness knew no boundaries, that the human heart, when it chose to open up, could create connections that lasted a lifetime. He said his people would never forget Henry Dawson, that his name would be told in stories passed down from generation to generation, that he will live as long as there was someone to remember. And then, following an ancient tradition, Kuruk placed an eagle feather on his friend's grave, the highest symbol of honor his people knew, for a man who deserved every bit of her. This is the story of Henry Dawson, a lone miner who opened his door one winter night, a man who shared his fire when he could have protected only himself, an ordinary person who made an extraordinary choice. And that choice changed everything, not just his life, but the lives of everyone he touched. Not just one winter, but all the seasons that came after. Not just a moment, but decades of friendship, purpose, and belonging. Because that's how kindness works. It starts small, an open door, a shared fire, an outstretched hand. But she grows, it spreads, it multiplies in ways we cannot predict. Henry didn't know, on that freezing night, that he was planting a seed. I didn't know that seed would grow into a tree that would provide shade for many. He didn't know that his life, which seemed so empty and lonely, was about to be filled with more wealth than any mind could offer. He just knew there was someone who needed help, and he chose to help. Sometimes that's all we need to know. The rest, life takes care of revealing. A shared fire in winter, a life transformed in spring, and a story worth telling forever.